Hello, everyone. I thought I would review The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and I will be mentioning spoilers here because I want to talk about this book fully. So if you haven't read it or you are planning to read it, then I would go ahead and do that before watching this review. And of course, Nathaniel Hawthorne is one of my favorite authors. In fact, in terms of pure prose writing, he might actually be my favorite. Herman Melville is definitely a close second. Um, and in some cases, I kind of go back and forth between them. But Hawthorne is definitely one of my favorite authors. I relate to him so much. Um, Quite often, sometimes I'll be reading him and I'll think, I could have written a sentence like that. I relate to him on a deep emotional and visceral level. And of course, I've read The Scarlet Letter and I've read The House of Seven Gables, and I've gotten a lot from those books. In fact, I'm writing a story now that is very similar to The Scarlet Letter. And recently, I went to Nathaniel Hawthorne's grave and um, paid my respects, wrote by his grave, read by his grave, read this very book, some of it by his grave, and so I have a lot of emotional attachment to this book in particular. Um, and so I thought I would just give my a basic summary of the book, and then I'll give my thoughts on it. Um, Now, Blithedale was based on was inspired by the fictional community, was inspired by this socialist farm that Hawthorne stayed on for a time, which essentially it was a farm where it rejected capitalism, so to speak. It was a place for artists, for for poets to gather and to have intellectual conversation. But it was also um, a running farm that operated. They had to do physical labor. Um, on one hand, I would love to be a part of a community like that. I think it would be wonderful to be able to be in an environment where you can converse and be with fellow artists, fellow intellectuals, people who you don't often get to see or interact with very much um, in your everyday life because we're so distracted by capitalism and making a buck and all of that. At the same time, I would not enjoy the farm work and in the story actually you have Coverdale, who is the main character, who is a poet who goes there, but he finds that doing the farm work is not something that he particularly enjoys. That he starts to lose his passion for art, and I'm thinking, yeah, I could definitely see that happening to me if I had to do labor like that. And so anyway, that would be a mixed blessing. We need to find a socialist community where we're not engaged in intense physical labor. If that were so, I would spend because my primary contribution would be intellectual, and so if everything was about hard labor, I would probably be kicked out of the community. To be perfectly honest. Um, but anyway, so the it's essentially one of the references here is that this is very the Blithedale Romance is very much about the idea of Eden, of them finding an Eden, but ultimately it turns out to be a false Eden, a fall from paradise, because the characters ultimately find that many of the same problems that existed outside the community also exist inside the community. Um, the Blithedale is run by a couple of people, by Zenoba, who I actually mispronounced Zenoba for the longest time, but anyway, who is essentially a feminist, an intellectual, um, a literary critic. She was based somewhat off of the feminist Margaret Fuller, who was not a member of the Socialist Farm, the real one, officially, but visited there quite often and was also a feminist and intellectual. In fact, I'm actually there's no doubt I think that she was, because she uses terms like woman this, woman is a victim, woman should take control in society, and all of that. And it's very similar to the kind of language um, that that Zenobia uses, and so it's very clear that I think she was based somewhat on Margaret Fuller. Even her tragic end is somewhat based on it, because Margaret Fuller unfortunately went to Europe, became like a foreign correspondent, and then when she was on her way back to the United States, her just like almost offshore near this island called Fire Island. Her ship wrecked, and during a storm, and then apparently she was swept off the boat by a wave, possibly drowned, and was never seen again. And it's really unfortunate. I was sad reading this, because knowing that it was based somewhat on a real individual who had thoughts and dreams that I think are quite admirable, and so to resonate on that level, it impacted me very deeply, because I related to her almost on a soulful level, because Zenobia is not just a fictional character. She's based on someone who was um, quite real. So that was somewhat transcendent experience for me. Um, but anyway, so you have this community, and Coverdale is really more of just an observer. He doesn't actually do he's somewhat of a peeping tom actually at times too. And anyway, and so then you have the character of Hollingsworth, who is someone who he's interested in criminal reform, and reforming criminals, and he's definitely more of a misogynist, a sexist, and he's someone who in many ways is the complete opposite of Zenobia, but because he has such a strong visceral presence, Zenobia, in a way that is also that was somewhat hypocritical, I think, um, ends up agreeing with him in some of his misogynistic attitudes, and really betrays some of her own values, because she ends up falling in love with Hollingsworth, and she compromises, I think, some of her principles because of that. And at the same time, you have the character of Priscilla, who is a young girl who comes there. I mean, a teenager, I believe, and she is innocent, somewhat naive. And later, you find out that Priscilla was this woman called the Veiled Lady, who was this under control of this magician called Westerfield, or I may be pronouncing his name wrong, but anyway, and he is kind of what you might call a sadistic magician. He's somewhat that you can definitely tell an almost an archetype for Satan. It's implied that he may have had a relationship with Zenobia in the past, and it turns out later that Zenobia and Priscilla are actually half sisters. But Zenobia, of course, is quite jealous of Priscilla, because Hollingsworth is falling in love with her, and so she ends up handing her over to the magician, and which, of course, angers Hollingsworth, and he ends up rescuing Priscilla. But then, of course, he ends up rejecting Zenobia, who is so devastated by this loss, the fact that she put all of her hope in Hollingsworth, that she ultimately decides to end her life by drowning in um, drowning in a lake. And so that ends up becoming the climax of the book, and where all of her sorrow is emerged in water. And right before she dies, she ends up talking to Miles, uh, um, I believe his name is Miles, to Coverdale, and ends up essentially saying, "Well, I could have been romantically interested in you, but because you are a very handsome man, but ultimately and a very poetic person, but ultimately I don't find beauty. I've never found beauty to be alluring to me. I was always much more interested in strong visceral personality, essentially." And it's kind of sad, because you can kind of tell that Coverdale really cared for Zenobia, and intellectually they were quite compatible, but she was interested in Hollingsworth, who in many ways was almost the complete opposite of her, which makes Zenobia a very complicated character. Um, she is she is a woman of contradictions. She is a feminist, but at the same time, she portrays some of those values. Um, and so, and which I don't think the reader should judge her for it. I think it makes her human. I think it makes her, uh, the best characters are the ones that have those internal contradictions. The people who are perfectly consistent are boring. So I don't think we should judge Zenoba. We should try to understand her. How I think that the contradiction lied in the fact that that I think she felt helpless being in a world dominated by men. So she spoke out against that. But at the same time, I think that she felt that because she felt powerless, she tried to attain power through men, which led to that internal contradiction. So um, Zenobia is a victim, I think, of pride, her own pride, but also her own circumstances. I thought she was a really well written character. In fact, I'll read to you here um, what I think is one of the best lines that Hawthorne writes after after she takes her own life, where he says, "The flitting moment after Zenobia sank into the dark pool, when her breath was gone, and her soul at her lips, was as long in its capacity of God's infinite forgiveness as the lifetime of the world," which essentially means he hopes that in the end, um, Zenobia was able to find forgiveness. That in that last moment, that perhaps she had some regret, and I think that her death and fate resembles somewhat, I think, the fate of Ophelia, tragic, fallen women who ultimately cannot deal with life and the circumstances around them, but there's still hope that perhaps they can find some divine peace in the end. And Zenobia, I think, is one of the most, I think, well-written characters because of her internal contradictions, because of the fact she is so human. I related to that on a very deep level. Um, I can only dream to write characters like that. I'm trying to right now in the character of Eleanor Blackwood in the story that I'm writing, and of course Catherine Harris, the character from my previous book, The Ecstasy and the Ignominy, also I think has some traits that are similar to Zenobia, although they're very different in other ways. But anyway, yes, I found the Blithedale Romance to be a really fascinating, enchanting read. It's very different from Hawthorne's other books, but I think it's definitely worth checking out. It resonated with me quite a lot. So I hoped you got something out of this review today. Again, if you would like to support this channel, my books are linked in the description section. And until next time, goodbye.